All right, this is Cs50, and this is our last week in this here studio as we focus finally on web programming using not only Python, but a framework within Python called Flask, and combining with web programming HTML, CSS, perhaps some JavaScript, and so many of the ideas that we've been exploring over the past several weeks. Indeed, today is really about combining all of those various building blocks so that ultimately you can build something of your own, not only for this week's problem set, but perhaps, if you so choose, for your final project as well. Now let's consider where we left off last time, which was introducing HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, whereby we introduced you to how the browsers of the world and the web servers of the world intercommunicate using HTTP and a whole bunch of other protocols underneath those like IP and TCP in particular. So last week, though, when we began to write HTML and CSS and even a little bit of JavaScript, recall that we served up the web pages that we wrote by using a very simple command in VS Code that we pre-installed for you, namely HTTP-server. This was a little program whose purpose in life was just to listen for HTTP requests coming from your browser, or really any browser, and respond to them by sending the contents of files from your code space to the browser. Typically a .html file, but if you had an image like a ping or a GIF, it too could get sent. A JavaScript file, a CSS file, really any files stored in your code space could be served up by HTTP server statically. And indeed, that's the key word here, is that everything we did last week was, within the context of HTML and CSS, static. We wrote it, we saved it or auto-saved it, and then we loaded it in our browser. If we wanted to make a change, we would go edit the file, resave it, or let it auto-save, and we would reload in the browser. But only once we got to JavaScript did we have any kind of dynamism. When I demonstrated, for instance, very briefly, how we might implement something like autocomplete, searching for all of the words that start with CAT in that big dictionary from problem set 5. But today, we're going to focus on things more server side. In fact, even the little bit about JavaScript that we introduced last week was all client side. That JavaScript code was written once on the server, downloaded to the browser, and then executed in the browser. But as a result, that JavaScript code didn't have access to, for instance, any information that might be stored in a database unless somehow we enable it to somehow communicate again and again with that server. So really what we're going to do today is dive into the world of web programming, where we're actually going to write code in Python using functions and loops and conditionals. And unlike last week, we are going to use code to generate our HTML for us so that we can stop doing everything by hand, especially for websites that might have dozens, hundreds, thousands of web pages. There's no human manually generating each of those web pages. It's somehow dynamically generated through web programming. So let's begin where we began last time, focusing on the structure of how we might request web pages, because we're going to make a little tweak this week. In particular, last week we looked at a canonical URL like this: HTTPS, which is the protocol or scheme, www.example.com/. And recall that the slash typically indicated that we wanted the default web page for the website. Now, that wasn't really germane last week when we were playing with a whole folder of files, but if you were to request the default web page on a website, it's typically, by convention, literally a file called index.html, at least on a lot of platforms. Sometimes it might be called index.htm. Sometimes it might be called default.aspx. There's different conventions, but very often when you just request slash, you're technically referring to a very specific file that has been configured on the server to be the default page that's served up. But you can, of course, be specifying specific files or even folders. So we looked at URL formats like this. If you want file.html, you simply append that to the end of the slash. If you want the default web page inside of a folder, you might do /folder/, and the server would serve that file up for you. If you wanted to be more explicit, you could specify /folder/file.html so that you can actually grab a specific file from a specific folder, and suffice it to say you can nest these things again and again if you've got multiple folders and subfolders. But today, and really onward, we're going to start talking about everything after the TLD as really being the path that the browser is requesting. So /path is just meant to generically mean whatever files and or folders are being requested in URLs. And we're also going to introduce slightly different nomenclature this week too, that yes, technically that's a path, specifying a specific file in a specific folder or set of folders. But in the context of web programming, what's especially powerful, those files and folders don't actually need to exist. Using web programming, using Python, for instance, you can specify specific paths that don't actually exist in your code space, but that represent a resource, indeed, uniform resource locator for URL, a resource that you want to be able to access via your browser. So route generically means what path do you want to select on a web server. Now, what's this going to mean for us? Well, once we have configured a route in code, we can even specify that that route takes user input. And recall that from last time, we introduced you to how Google.com works. And we didn't implement the back end of Google. We let Google do that. But we did implement our own front end for Google that allowed you to fill out a very simple form, click enter, and the web browser would then send automatically a request to Google server that somehow had key equals value, particularly Q for query equals, for instance, cat. And all of that followed a question mark. So this same URL format here, whereby we have /route, which refers to some path, and then question mark key equals value, and maybe an ampersand and more key equals values, means that today we're going to have the ability to implement the back end of Google if we so aspire, or really the back end of a website. And back end just means the part that really the programmer implements and touches. Front end generally means the part that the human, the user, interacts with. All right, so with that said, let me propose that if we want to be able to read URLs of this format that have some key equals value and maybe some other key equals value, we actually do need to introduce a bit of code. So let's consider now how this request, this HTTP request, is getting to the server. Well, recall that when you request something like cat via a web page submitting to Google via a form, technically inside of that virtual envelope is a message like get/search question mark Q equals cat. Then some mention of the version of the protocol being used, like version 2 of HTTP, maybe a reminder of the host of the server that's specifically being requested, and then a bunch of other stuff that we saw last time as well. And ideally, we want the server to respond to that request. But here's where things get interesting. How in the world do you go about writing code that opens up that virtual envelope, reads that get line and the /search and the question mark and all of those keys and values? Well, we could write code very methodically, maybe using a for loop and iterating over every character, but that sounds like a lot of work. And in fact, it's been much better in CS50 alone that once you understand some concept, rather than reinvent that wheel yourself, use a framework, or rather, use a library instead. And indeed, that's what we're going to focus on today, is a very popular micro framework in the world of Python, which means a relatively small library that solves some very common problems and saves us the trouble of having to write all of the code that reads the insides of those virtual envelopes and figure out exactly what web page is requested or route and exactly what keys and values were passed in. To do so, we're going to go ahead ultimately and not use HTTP-server anymore. That, recall, is a command that only serves up static content. Starting today, we're actually going to run a command, namely Flask run. So not only is Flask a library, as we'll soon see, which means we have functions and other features of it we can use in our own code, it's also, once you install it, a command that you can run in a terminal window like your own code space. And so ultimately, instead of running HTTP-server today, we're going to run Flask run to still start a web server, but a web server that's even smarter than HTTP server, because it's not just going to spit out the raw contents of files to the browser. It's actually going to execute your and my Python code to generate those web pages dynamically. So in order to get to that point, we're going to have to start creating some files of our own and really writing some programs of our own. And the convention when using Flask, this popular micro framework, which again is just a library that standardizes how you and I solve some common problems, we're going to need typically at least two files. One by convention called app.py, and a second one called requirements.txt or txt. And each of these files in conjunction will be understood by that Flask command, because Flask knows to look for a file like app.py and knows how to execute it. And as we've done so many times in past languages, here, for instance, now in Python, while using the Flask framework, is how we might implement the simplest of web applications. So at a glance, this is going to look a little strange because there's a lot going on the screen, but clearly that first line indicates that we are importing from a library called Flask some kind of feature known as Flask capital F. So it's a little weird, but that's often a convention to import from something lowercase, something that's capitalized, to make clear that it's really what's called a class in the world of object-oriented programming, but more on that down the line. And then the second line of code says to Flask, please turn this file into a web application. So this is a little arcane, but underscore underscore name underscore underscore is something we saw so briefly a few weeks back in week 6 when I said at the time you sometimes need to check what the name of this file is and does it equal quote unquote underscore underscore main underscore underscore, because that enables you to more correctly implement libraries of your own, which we did not do, but I just mentioned that you might see it in the wild. Well, here it is again in a different form. Underscore underscore name underscore underscore is essentially a special variable that refers to the name of this current file. So the second line of code is essentially telling Flask, please turn this file into a web application and let me refer to it via a variable called, quite simply, app. Now, after that, there's some new weird syntax, but this is technically just Python, a feature we haven't yet seen. Technically, you're seeing now the @ sign for probably the first time, app, which is that same variable, .route, and then an argument there too. So this is what's an example in Python of what's called a decorator. And a decorator is a feature of Python whereby you can wrap one function inside of another. For our purposes today, what this third line of code essentially means is, hey, Flask, please turn the following function into a route that can be served up by the server to a browser. What is that function? Well, the function that I want to associate with that route is literally a function called index, but I could call it anything I want. I could call it foo, bar, baz, or anything, but index makes sense if this is meant to be the index of my website. And the only thing that function does for now is literally return a string, or stir in Python speak, namely quote unquote hello world. So that is it. And the fact that the argument to the app.route function, whereby route is a function or method inside of that app variable or object, the quote unquote slash just tells Flask whenever the user visits like example.com/, please call this function and send to the browser whatever this function returns. Now, long story short, this is not the only way to implement a web application, but this is the way to do it using Flask, this very popular micro framework. If you were to use something else, like in Python, there's a framework called Django, and there's many others in many other languages as well. This just standardizes for us what are the conventions when I want to create a route and I want to return some HTML, because you can solve that problem any number of ways. But what's important today is really the application of last week's ideas, even though we're using a very particular framework. And this is not meant to say that you're learning Flask and CS50 per se, but you're learning a web framework that's going to be representative of many others out there as well. But we chose one that's both popular and relatively simple. So with that said, I think let's go ahead and implement the very first of our web applications here, namely by switching over to VS Code here. And within my VS Code environment, I've sort of hidden some distractions. I've already closed my activity bar and I've closed the File Explorer so that, as always, we have room for some code tabs and we have my terminal at the bottom. But like last week, I also have an additional tab inside of my terminal area here for not only the terminal window itself, but also these here ports. Recall that last time we talked about TCP ports in particular, unique integers that identify certain services like 80 for web servers or 443 for the secure version, HTTPS thereof. Here again, we see port 1337, which is meant to connote LEET, because this is a CS50 specific use of this TCP port. But soon we'll see another port just like we did last week when I launched HTTP server. So let's go ahead first and create a file, for instance, called app.py. And just to keep things simple, I'm going to isolate all of these files to a specific folder. So I'm going to create a new folder with make dir, and I'm going to call it hello for my first application called hello. I'm going to cd into hello, and indeed now I'm in there. And now I'm going to run code of app.py to begin writing the contents of this here web application. And for this, I'm pretty much just going to use the contents of the sample program we saw a moment ago by doing the following. I'm going to say from Flask, import Flask, lowercase f and uppercase f respectively. Then I'm going to say app equals capital Flask underscore underscore name underscore underscore, which is the line of code that says, hey, Flask, turn this file into a web application and give me a variable called app via which to reference it. And then down here, I'm going to do @app.route and then in parentheses pass in a single argument slash. I could use single quotes. I could use double quotes. For consistency with C, as we did in week 6, I'm going to keep using double quotes most of the time. Now I'm going to go ahead and define a function in Python called index, but I could call it anything I want. This particular function is not going to take any arguments, so all it's going to do is return a string or str of text, hello, comma, world. And that's it. Now, just to be consistent with style 50, I've actually deliberately left a couple of lines blank in between my function and everything above it, and that's just a stylistic convention in Python. But otherwise, this is just some relatively little Python code, albeit using a couple of new features, a new library, and using a new piece of syntax, the @ sign, for that so-called decorator. And again, to be clear, all a decorator does in Python, or in this particular case, is it says, hey, Python, turn the following function into one that should be called automatically whenever the user requests the /route. All right, I need to do one more thing, at least on some systems. Let me go ahead and run code of requirements.txt. And in this file, I'm going to simply specify what are all of the libraries that I want this web application to use. And I'm quite simply going to say Flask, capital F here. But strictly speaking, it's not necessary because in cs50.dev, because we've pre-installed Flask for you. But in general, and certainly in the real world, what I'm doing now is associating with this application 0 or more list of dependencies, libraries that I want someone to install in order to ensure that this thing here works. That's all I need to put in this file, but even though it's already been installed, what I can do is this. Let me go ahead and maximize my terminal window here, and let me run that command we ran briefly back in week 6 when we wanted to install libraries. I'm going to do pip install, and instead of installing cowsay or something silly like that again, I'm going to do pip install -r requirements.txt. And what this command would do for me, if Flask is not already installed, is it would install it for me on this here system. So I'm not going to bother executing that because I already did it earlier for everyone's code space, but that's indeed how we could use that requirements file to automatically install things without have to manually typing that and other things out. All right, well, let's go ahead now and do something incorrectly. Suppose I'm in the habit of forgetting things and I run http-server in my terminal window. I can certainly run it, and it's certainly going to work, especially if I override this helpful reminder we put in place to discourage you from doing this. But I'm going to say, nope, I want to go ahead and run it. I'm going to see the same kind of output as I saw last week. I'm going to be prompted to open in a browser that particular web application. But that particular web application is not really my own per se. It's just the contents of this folder. So if I go ahead and zoom in on the directory index of that there folder, we see my two files, app.py and requirements.txt. If I click on app.py, I'm not going to get a hello world. In fact, it was a little subtle, but what my Mac just did was it downloaded app.py, which is not the goal I want. And in fact, you've just let the world access your source code if there's anything sensitive in that there program, because the browser doesn't know what to do with an app.py file inside of my browser. So that was incorrect. So I'm going to go ahead and go back here. But just to make clear that we do indeed have a second port running now, just like last week, because HTTP server can't use port 80 or 443 because code spaces, that is cs50.dev, is already using that for you. It did choose the default port of 8080, which is commonly used for development purposes, and that's why we see not only 1337, but 8080 now as well. So let me go ahead and back to my terminal window, hit Control-C to interrupt HTTP server, and let me now do things the right way by running flask run enter. And what we'll see now is that my application is running not on 8080, but on 5000, which happens to be Flask's default choice of ports. But you can override this if you so choose. But I'm going to stick with that one. And now, even though it's a little underwhelming, I'll zoom in. Now I see hello, comma, world. And in fact, if I right-click or control-click on Chrome here, or your browser more generally, and for instance, view page source, you will see that there's really no even HTML here, just text, because what I've essentially sent to the browser is just literally hello, comma, world. But already, we have a building block here. Clearly, I can write Python code that generates output that is sent to the browser. So really, there's nothing stopping me from now sending not just raw text, but actual HTML to the browser. Let's do this sort of poorly at first. Let me go ahead and hide my terminal window just so we can focus on code now for a moment, even with Flask actually running. And this is going to look deliberately ugly for the moment, but let me go ahead and do this. If I want to send the browser a proper web page, Heck, I remember some HTML from last week. So open bracket, exclamation point, doc type HTML, close bracket, and then open bracket HTML, then lang equals quote unquote en for English. Then I'm going to go ahead and do head for the head of the page, and then title for the title therein. And I'm just going to say something like hello, comma, title, like I did last time. Let me close that title tag. Let me close that head tag. Let me open now my body tag. Inside the body, I'll say hello, comma, body. I'll close the body tag. I'll close the HTML tag, and I'll close my quotes. But I'm going to be careful here. Notice that I used an attribute value in here with double quotes. That's probably going to confuse Python because I have these outermost double quotes. So I can fix this in a couple of ways. I'm going to go ahead and use, therefore, single quotes on the outside of this Python string, which unlike C is fine for strings, not just chars as in C. And I think that will at least assure that the quote marks don't get confused. All right. This is probably not going to be the best design, and hopefully this is not how we generate web pages, but let me go ahead back to my other browser tab, which previously said hello world. Let me reload now, and I seem to have changed not only the output of this web program, but really the contents underneath the hood as well. Let me right-click or control-click on the white portion of my screen here, and there is some proper HTML. It's not particularly pretty printed. There's no new lines. There's no indentation. But if I scroll from left to right in my browser here, there is a well-formed web page as I intended. So again, not particularly fun, not particularly pretty, but we seem now to have the capability of writing code that generates not only text, but HTML as well. So how can we go about improving this program further? Well, let me do this. This is not really the nicest design. So let me go ahead and highlight all of this HTML I just wrote, and let me go ahead and cut it to my clipboard. And let's come back to that code file in a moment. Let me go ahead and reopen my terminal. I don't want to kill Flask run just because it's convenient to keep it running. So I'm going to create a second terminal window by clicking plus, and I can toggle between them at right here. So one is still running Flask. The other is now a blinking prompt. I'm in the wrong directory by default, so I do need to go back into my hello folder with cd hello. But in here, what I'm going to do now is this. I'm going to go ahead and create another folder inside of this that by convention is called templates. And when I hit enter here, I'm going to then do cd templates to go inside of it. And now I'm going to create an actual full-fledged HTML file, index.html by convention. Enter. And inside of this file, I'm going to go ahead and paste that long string of HTML. And I'm going to go ahead and clean it up to look a little bit more like it looked last week. And I'm going to even stylize it further here so everything's very pretty printed and human readable. And I'm going to put the head up there. I'm going to put the body down here. And below that, I will close my HTML tag. So no different in terms of the content, but now I have all my HTML in an actual file. All right, what do I now do with this? Well, wouldn't it be nice if I could go back into app.py and say, don't return just hello world, don't return this long, messy string of HTML, but return the contents of a file called index.html. Well, to do that, I can import not just Flask capital F from the Flask library. I can also import a function called render template. This is a function specific to Flask, but it does exactly that. It will render a template for you in the sense of it will go open an HTML file for you. It will then send it from server to browser. And as we'll soon see, it can even do some fancier stuff than that. But now, instead of returning quote unquote hello world or quote unquote a big long string of HTML, what I'm actually going to do is something like this. I'm going to say like HTML equals render template. And what template do I want to render? Index.html. And I'm going to store that template, so to speak, in an HTML variable. And then I'm going to return that variable. Of course, as we've seen in C and Python and even JavaScript, we don't really need variables per se if we're just defining them and using them once. So I can actually tighten this up a bit. Let me go ahead and highlight the actual function call, get rid of the variable, and let me just immediately return the return value of render template, passing in index.html. Now notice the subtlety. If I go back to my terminal window, recall that I created index.html inside of my templates folder, which is inside of my hello folder. But render template is smart. As its name implies, its purpose in life is to render a so-called template. More on what we really mean on that in a moment. But by default, Flask knows that if you're trying to render a template, oh, sure, it must be in your templates folder. It's got to be all lowercase, templates. Your file has to be exactly named as I'm specifying here. But this is now how a web server can associate a route like / with a specific file on the actual server, no matter what folder it might be in. So let me go back to my other tab. Let me go ahead and cross my fingers as always and click reload. And so far, so good. And in fact, just to prove to you that this is the new version of my HTML that was pre-printed, let me go to View Page Source. And there indeed it is, printed in the browser's memory, just as I wrote it on the server. All right, so now let's take a look at the code as we left it, whereby for the /route, we are returning the return value of the render template function once passed an argument of index.html. And let's see if we can't make our web application truly more dynamic, so that it's not just saying hello title, hello body all of the time, but ideally saying hello to a particular person. Now, how can I possibly pass user input to a web application? Because my users on the internet certainly don't have access to my keyboard, let alone my terminal window. They only have access to my website via a browser. But of course, as we saw in the Google example, if you were to pass in somehow at the end of the URL, not just a route, but also a question mark and key equals value, maybe an ampersand, key equals value, maybe another ampersand, key equals value, we can somehow send from the browser to the server user input. Of course, that user input ideally does not come from the human typing it in manually to the URL, but filling out a form, hitting enter, and letting the browser convert that form to the appropriate GET request in the URL. But let's start to simulate this for now. Let me go back to this URL here, put my cursor at the end of it, and say question mark name equals, for instance, David. The intent being that I want this site to say hello David instead of hello title and hello body. Enter. Unfortunately, when I hit enter, nothing changes. And I can confirm as much by viewing source. And indeed, nothing about the page has changed because we haven't done anything dynamic in code. But I do think we can fix this. Let me go back over to VS Code here, and let me propose that we go into the template first, which currently only says hello title, hello body. Let's go ahead and simplify the title for now and focus on just dynamically changing the body. And let me propose that what I really want this thing to say is hello, and then a placeholder. So I don't want to literally say placeholder, where placeholder is just something into which we plug in a value, because now I'm going to see a website that says hello, comma, placeholder. So the syntax you're about to see is a little bit different, but it's going to be a technique via which I can tell Python, specifically Flask, to substitute a value for this here placeholder. And the syntax for that, when using Flask, is to do 2 curly braces on the left and 2 curly braces on the right. It's a little different from our F strings or format strings in Python alone, but in the context of an HTML template, the way you specify, hey Flask, substitute a value here, is indeed with 2 curly braces on the left and the right. Now, of course, nothing's going to happen yet until I go back to app.py and actually tell the template somehow to plug in a value therein. Now, how can I go about doing this? Well, the simplest way, which is as follows. In addition to importing Flask and render template, I'm also going to import another variable that comes with the Flask framework called request. And this is a special object that's going to give me access to all of the HTTP parameters, the user input in the HTTP request that's causing this code to be executed. So how do I use that? Well, let me go down here and let me create a variable called anything, but I'll call it name. And I'm going to go ahead and set that equal to something like request.args, open bracket, quote unquote, name, close quote. Now, what in the world is going on here? Well, it turns out what we've introduced here now is a special variable, request.args, that somehow magically, automatically stores all of those key value pairs. And here again is why we're using a framework like Flask, because it's not going to be particularly fun code to have to write code that opens that virtual envelope, reads the HTTP message inside of it, parses, or that is analyzes and figures out what is each key, what is each value, what route is requested. Like every website on the internet practically is probably doing exactly that nowadays. We might as well not reinvent that wheel ourselves. So in request.args, we have this special variable that comes with Flask that just gives us a Python dictionary that contains all of those key value pairs. And in fact, think back to week 5 when I proposed that dictionaries or dicts in Python are so very useful because they allow you to associate keys with values, keys with values. That's what Flask is doing here. So if I go back to my code, what we really see is that I'm creating a variable called name, and I'm setting it equal to the value of the name key inside of this dictionary. That is, request.args is a Python dictionary at this point. How now do I pass in the value of that variable to my template so that we actually see hello, comma, David or hello, comma, someone else? Well, in app.py, I have to pass now a second argument to render template. And the convention for that is placeholder equals name. In other words, I can use Python's feature for named parameters, which we've seen before, like the print function in Python has that end parameter that we can use to override the line ending, which is by default /n. Here, I'm passing in a positional parameter in Python, which just means the first one, first position. But then I'm passing in a second parameter that has an explicit name, and the name I'm giving it is literally placeholder. Why? Because I want Flask to replace placeholder in this template with the actual value of the name variable. So if I go back to my second tab here, which previously said hello title, hello body, but notice a moment ago we passed in question mark name equals David, which was previously ignored. Now if I reload this page, having changed my Python code in app.py, there is my hello David, and my tab is more simply now just hello. All right, unfortunately, this is not the best solution. Why? Because suppose that a user doesn't visit this URL and certainly doesn't have the wherewithal to type in manually question mark name equals David. Let me go ahead and delete that HTTP parameter, the key value pair. Let me go ahead and reload this page now. And now I got a bad request, a 400 error, which means I did not request this website correctly. Now that's just kind of bad design, right? Because surely the user should be able to visit a URL without having to manually type in parameters. So how do we fix this? Let me go back to my other tab for VS Code. Let me go ahead and open up app.py, and it seems to be the case that I'm just blindly assuming on lines 8 and 9 at the moment that there will be a key called name inside of this dictionary. And clearly that's not the case if the user has not visited a URL that has question mark name equals something. So I think we just want to use some week 1 style logic using Python syntax specifically to say something like this. Let me go ahead and change line 8 to ask a question first. If there is a name key inside of request.args, then and only then go ahead and create a variable called name whose value is request.args quote unquote name. Else, if there is no name key in that dictionary, we've got to handle that situation, which I wasn't a moment ago. All right, fine. Let's create a name variable and set it equal to some default value like world. And now line 12 can remain unchanged because no matter what, I'm passing in a legitimate value for name that's either whatever the human typed in the URL bar, for instance, or it is by default world. So if I go back now to my other tab, and without changing the URL, I just click reload, now we're back to something correct, if underwhelming, that says hello, comma, world. Of course, this is a little maybe suboptimally designed in that, well, I've used my placeholder already. What if I want to say 2 placeholders or 3 placeholders or more? I probably shouldn't be in the habit of literally using the word placeholder in my template, even though that's what it is. Let me go ahead and be a little more descriptive, just like with our variable names in general. And let me go ahead and say what I really want here is hello, comma, name, where I want the value of name to be interpolated, just like in an F string, inside of these double curly braces. But I now need to change my code. Because I've now changed my placeholder to literally be name, this is going to look a little weird, but the convention in using this library is quite often to say now name equals name. Why? Because the name of the parameter I'm passing in to the left of the equal sign must match the name of the parameter that I'm using in my template. Though the value that I want to pass in for that placeholder can be anything I want. It can literally be quote unquote David. But if the value is in a variable, then what I want to do is pass in the name of that variable. So this looks a little stupid, admittedly, but this is the convention, for better or for worse. Name equals name means plug in the value of the name on the right for the template placeholder called name on the left. That's all. But this is indeed a common convention. Now, is there a better way to do this? Well, this feels a little bulky to have 4 lines of code, if this, else that, just to check if an HTTP parameter was passed in. And in fact, there is. The convention in Flask would actually be to not bother with this explicit if else, but instead to do something like this. Name equals request.args, and then specifically call a method or a function called get, whose purpose in life is to get the value of a key. What key? Well, the name key. And what the get function also does for us is if it can't find a value there, you can specify a default value. So if you want the default value to be world, you pass that in as a second argument. So the behavior now is going to be no different. But if I go back to my other tab and click reload, nothing changes, but it's still working. It's not showing some error. However, if I go into my URL bar at top and add / name equals David, zoom out, and hit enter, it's still working in that case as well. But I've distilled those 4 lines of logic now into something a little simpler by actually having now a use of the get method, which is doing more of that logic for me. All right, so